All right. So, to those special subscribers who subscribe to us on Patreon, we're going to talk about with Jerry about his thoughts about the Garden of Eden, the Dominion Mandate, all of that stuff. So we just got done talking about the makers versus the takers, and there's this idea there that wealth creators, businessmen, entrepreneurs, all that stuff, good. Extractors, wealth extractors, politicians, rulers, bad, right? But I want to kind of dive into the implications for that as it relates to eschatology, dominion, all of that stuff. So you made a post a while ago about your thoughts on the garden and how we should view the garden dominion mandate now. And so I wanted you to just kind of talk about that. Is there some way that you think most people are thinking about it, that maybe they should, alter the way that they think about it? What were you trying to say with that post?
I was just trying to push back on something that I hear a lot of, which is an attempt to align Christianity with environmentalism. And the idea is that people cite the command that God gave to Adam to guard. They'll cite it as that God said to guard the earth, right? So we're supposed to guard the earth. Sorry, I'm looking up the passage while we're speaking, so that's why there's all this side stuff going on.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
And the fact is that he didn't. What happens is that the command that God gives to Adam regarding the garden is frequently applied to the whole earth, when those aren't the same things at all. Adam has certain instructions about the garden and has other instructions about the earth. So there's something the Episcopal Church put out where quoted that, so sort of quoted it, misquoted it, that we're to dress and keep the earth is what Adam was told, but that's not true. He was to dress and keep the garden,
okay,
to avoid the garden, to shamar the garden. It never says that about the earth.
Okay, so then what should be our kind of disposition towards the earth now? Because I've been in that camp. I've always been, hey, God told Adam to keep the garden. He told him to plow it and all that stuff. And you kind of, layer that over top of now, like what we're doing now here in the earth. So is that, what's kind of your thoughts about how we should be approaching the earth and the materials and resource allocation, all that stuff now in relation to that?
Yeah, and I'm not downstream enough to say how environmentalist we should or shouldn't be. What I just want to do is get the text right, and then people can apply it however they want to apply it. I mean, however they see fit. So I'm not saying. See, if you take away someone's argument for a thing, they frequently think you're denying the thing.
Okay.
Whereas there might be other good reasons to protect the earth, but don't take a command out of context, a command about the garden, and then apply it to the earth, and then misunderstand. Like, for instance, let me give you a parallel example. Matthew 25 has the parable of the sheep and the goats.
Mm-hmm.
I won't go into it now, but I think there's good reason to believe that this is not about rich versus poor. This is about how Christians are received. So this is those least of my brethren, I believe, are Christians that Jesus is referring to. Now, you might disagree, right? That's fine. I think there's some hints in the text that that's the case. But sometimes when I mention that interpretation to people, they say, oh, so you don't think we ought to do anything for the poor? And I say, no, there's plenty of biblical material that says do something for the poor. But I think this is a warning to the nations about how they receive Jesus as disciples, who are poor. Jesus's poor disciples are sent out into the world, and how will the nations receive them? So I can believe that you should take care of the poor and still believe that passage is not mainly focused on class, but mainly focused on how you treat Jesus's brethren, who are his actual followers. And I'd say the same thing here. So let's leave off how we act towards the earth and just say that the passage is that, okay, let us, here's here's a 125. God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Um, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves on the earth. So these words are not particularly gentle words.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Sorry to cut you off. So I think the way I took it was you're making an environmental. I mean, the application that you're making is an environmental one. How maybe you're addressing people who think that we shouldn't do anything with the earth because we need to leave it pristine. We need to keep it, like God said. But some of us who take more of a dominion kind of approach are ones who are like, hey, actually engage in business, use the resources, use all of the stuff that God's given us to create and beautify and all of that stuff. And I think, okay, so that's kind of the mindset you're in. That clarifies for me. What?
Yeah, I didn't do a good job of explaining it online, and I didn't do a good job of explaining it here. So let me try to break it down again. To do this, I kind of have to touch on the thesis of the thesis, which is that the garden is God's. It's a little replica of heaven on earth. God made it. It doesn't need anybody to change it. The job of Adam and the woman, the man and the woman, was to live there, to learn, to take care of it, not to exercise dominion there. That's God's house.
Okay.
Then, having studied in God's house, just like with your kids, you've got sons and daughters, presumably, they don't exercise a lot of dominion in your house, right? You're teaching. Do you have children? If you don't.
One. Yep.
Okay, you have a child. Okay, so you're teaching your child how to live in Father's house, the ways of it. Yeah. It's not a place for ambition. It's not a place for, I think I'll knock that wall out and I think I'll do that. No,
right.
This is mom and dad's house, right? But you learn how to live, and then you're going to go out into the world and you're going to start building your own home, building your own business, so that in the garden, it's a passive protective role, not a dominion role. Okay. And then on the basis of that, having apprenticed, the whole point of my thesis is that Adam is an apprentice to God, a co-regent, a prince waiting to become a king. So a prince living in the palace, learning the ways of the palace, who then eventually becomes a king on his own, still under the emperor, and goes out and builds kingdoms. So that there's a passivity in the garden, passivity and protection. You keep the garden. Why do you keep the garden? Because God planted it. It's a good garden. It doesn't need improvement ideas from you.
Gotcha.
But then you go out into the world, and then what do? You kavash, you radu.
Right.
I mean, you're filling it. These words are really kavash, conquer.
Yeah.
Right? You are forcing your will on the earth, but only because you learned from God how to do it right. So you don't impose your will on the garden. The garden is the place where you learn God's will, and then you impose your God-formed will out there on the earth.
Oh, that's awesome. You see microcosms of that in, like you're saying, with the family. The man is raised up in his house, and then he leaves his father and his mother, and he goes and takes on a wife. I'll need time to digest that, but I get what you're saying.
So I think a modern application is church is not a place for dominion. Church is not a place to exercise your ambition. Church is, that would be my application. In the temple, you don't have a lot of dominion. In the temple, you mentioned microcosms, so you're probably on board with the idea that the temple is a representation of the garden.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Just from talking to
Temple.
you, I get a sense that you tabernacle in the temple, kind
Yep.
of who you are and what you've read. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have heaven, you get a little representation of heaven on earth. That's the garden. And then you
Mhm.
have an architectural representation of the garden in the tabernacle, and then later in the temple. And then the church becomes the temple representation, of,
Yeah.
so
Yep.
these are microcosms. That's not an idea that's new with me. I mean, Josephus said that. That goes back really far, and the textual evidence is very strong that that's what's going on. Well, then, what I would say is I really like people who are entrepreneurial, but church is nobody's entrepreneurial venture
Right.
except God's. And the church is not your family business. And I've seen this happen where people turn the church into a family business. The church is God's family business, and you're the child if you're a church leader. So on Sunday morning, when I'm in church as an ordained minister, I have a different orientation towards church when I go out there on Monday and I'm trying to grow market share,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
maybe compete with competitors, whatever. That's appropriate. I'm kavashing,
Yes.
right? I'm raduing, but church is not the place for that. And I think I'm glad that you can receive this, because I think it is so important. So many of the problems that we face right now in evangelicalism are that church has become, in the megachurch world and other places, the avenue for the ambition of ambitious religious leaders. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, so you're saying ambition is bad? No, ambition is fine, but there is a different economy inside the garden. There's a received economy. There was a received structure. There's a received order. God created a business model in the garden, and it's like a franchise. Hey, man and woman, run the system. Well, it's boring. Keep running the system. Because when you're done, when you really learn, when you're ready, I'm going to tell you can eat of that tree there, and then you'll be rulers like me. And then you're going to go out and plant your own gardens.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. I I'm fortunate enough to be in a church where that understanding is pervasive. I mean, the distinction between how you act within the church, the church's role in society versus other areas. Not saying that they're separate. We're not like two kingdoms kind of
Right.
people, but just those distinct roles is are really important to understand. Um, and I think what's your plans for that article? I
I
mean, that
don't, I
piece.
don't, well, it's 240 pages, and it's got long blocks of Hebrew quotes and Aramaic quotes and Latin quotes and Greek quotes. So it's kind of unpublishable
Okay.
for
Well,
popular purposes. So I thought maybe right through it. Again, it's one of these things where I don't expect the good stuff. The stuff that I like the most, the stuff that we really put our heart into and really said, God, I don't care whether it'll sell. I don't care whether it'll preach. I just want to know. There's this idea. Sometimes preachers will talk to each other and you'll mention something and they'll say, that'll preach. And it's like,
yeah.
yeah, I know it'll preach, but is it true? So this was an area of study where my wife and I just wanted to know God's love language is Hebrew. We taught ourselves Hebrew and just read through the creation account, I don't know, 100 times maybe. I mean, every day for like 5 years, just to know what God thought,
Mhm.
right? Like every word choice very carefully. Why he came, it was so. What does he mean there? Bereshit. What does it? What does it in the beginning mean?
Yeah.
That's a really important word. It's the first word in the Bible.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's
Lots
a
of
year on
discussion
that,
about that.
right? So I maybe write a series of books like The First Kingdom, The First Marriage, The First Murder, The First whatever, kind of a more accessible. Maybe I could write a series of books that are more accessible. But it's basically like that. It's paying super close attention to the text
Yeah.
and noticing that the tone of the command about how to relate to the garden is extremely different from the tone about how to relate to the world. The
Okay.
garden is shamarred. It's guarded. We're never told to guard the world. We're told to guard the garden. We are preserving the garden. We're not preserving the world. We're not. And I think modern environmentalism at its heart made that mistake from the very beginning and thought that our job is to preserve the world.
Mhm.
rather than transform it. But they didn't get that out of nowhere. God did say, dress and keep, but he said it about the garden, not the world. The garden
Right.
was in some sense supposed to be pristine because God made that himself.
Right.
If God
Yeah.
comes down and builds a building, you don't, I think I'm going to make some modifications. No, you study that building and then you say, how can I learn to make a similar building?
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. And it's unfortunate that the implication of a lot of modern environmentalist ideas is that humanity is a stain on the earth
Right.
because of the way that we operate in the world. You can't really get away from it if you're taking raw materials and exploiting the earth, so to speak.
Or
Yeah, it puts us
kibosing
in.
it.
Yeah, it puts us in a terrible position where we can't do anything. I mean, God tells us in multiple places to build businesses, be wealth creators, all that stuff, like you said in your book. But we can't really do that if we take a modern environmentalist
Well, he tells them in
viewpoint.
Deuteronomy that, hey, one of the great things about the promised land is that there's copper that can be mined.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? There's copper there. So what are they going to do? Is it magic to get the copper out of the ground? Not that's mining. He's
Right.
telling them to be miners. So here's the pun. In the garden, they're miners, minors. They're not dominion people in the garden because the garden is a school.
Okay.
Right? Then, having been schooled, you go out into the earth and you become miners, miners. You become exploiters in the good sense. You go out there and you shape the world. The wilderness wants to be shaped. They will resist us, but God made it. But it's a challenge God made for us. It's interesting. He's using words like conquer. You're supposed to conquer the earth.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we're not a stain. To the degree that we're a stain is after we sinned, we're a stain on the garden. So we're put out, right? But humanity in unfallen state isn't even a stain on the garden. And we're not a stain on the earth, except to the degree that we disobey God. One of the ways we disobey God is not exercising dominion. Then we become a stain on the earth by not kiboshing it, by not exercising dominion, because it doesn't work right if we're not exercising dominion over it.
I know. Yeah. Gosh. Okay. I'll wrap it up here, just because we've been going for a long time, and I really appreciate your time. But just as a kind of a last minute thing, if we didn't do that kind of thing, take the materials of the earth, sand, light, heat, all this stuff, we couldn't be doing this podcast right now, this video. Couldn't be doing any of this. So there's lots of
nor could the people who are using podcasts and videos to tell us not to exercise dominion.
That's right. That's right, man. Jerry, thank you so much for joining me. This time has just been so beneficial. I hope everyone listening gets as much out of it as I did. Everyone who's listening, here's the book. If you're watching on Zoom, The Makers versus the Takers by Jerry Bowyer. Get it, read it. You will not be disappointed. So thank you, Jerry. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Dustin. Thank you. God bless you and your viewers and listeners.
Thank you.